A while ago, I was watching somebody that I used to watch a lot when I was younger, an interviewer. He was on this TV show, and they're talking about the book that he brought out about his work. And one of the questions was like, okay, what is the most important part about an interview? Because he's interviewed politicians, movie stars, I mean, singers, anybody, everybody almost that he's interviewed. So,
Yeah.
and his answer was the most important part of an interview is the first question. And that made me think about how I talk with people and start the podcast episodes. And so ever since I've actually worked at the first questions or first remarks and make them a little bit better. And I've noticed good results from my guests.
Okay.
But especially for you, Gavin, I'm going to do 2 questions.
Okay.
So here we go. And I'm going to give them back to back, and then you can answer any way you like. So is it true that once you were thrown through a Sea Point Studios drywall during a combatives demonstration? And is it also true that once upon a time you beat up a poor SAN Parks Ranger during a contracted government training session?
Both of those are true.
and you can imagine who gave me that.
Yeah, I know exactly who gave you that.
Yeah.
The first one was actually quite funny, because there was a demo that we did when Skulk was starting one of his new studios in it's a quite upmarket part of town,
Yeah.
and it was in a yoga studio. So it was all these yoga ladies who were coming to see this demonstration, and it involved doing when me and Skulk used to demonstrate stuff, we didn't have anything choreographed. It was we went as if it was real, you know.
Yeah.
And so it just so happened that he pushed me off balance, and we went through a drywall, and made one studio into a really big studio. And everyone was very shocked by that and taken aback by how aggressive it all was. But that's just how it is. And yeah, that happened. And we had to, Skulk had to pay for the repairs, not me, luckily.
How did the seminar go afterwards?
I think they were a bit like shocked at how it didn't really gel with what they thought it was going to be. But we got some students, and it worked for a while. And then I actually ran that studio for a good few months. So, yeah, it was a fun one.
And as for question 2?
The question 2, yeah, that was an interesting one, because we were away in another town, contracted to train some park rangers. And I come from a very middle-class background. I never did anything wrong. I never got into fights as a kid. People were scared of me, so I never got into any trouble. But in South Africa, everyone's seen something, everyone's witnessed crime, and to some degree, but I never really got into any trouble. And so I used to feel a little bit untested. Like some guys have got that background that they know they can throw a punch and they can take a punch and all that kind of stuff. So I always used to feel a little bit untested until this day, where one of the park rangers that we were training, he was going on a little bit, how some guys do, just not sure about if this technique is really going to work, and is it really going to happen that way? What if this happens? What if that happens? Always asking these kinds of questions. And eventually I was doing the line, I was walking up and down the line, just checking everybody. And as I walked past, he decided he's going to attack me from behind. And I took him down, put him down hard. And it was quite interesting for me. It was an eye-opener for him, because he realized the technique actually does work. But it was quite cool for me as well, because I felt I got a little bit tested, and everything came out right. So
yeah, everybody wins.
Everybody wins.
And just for the audience, I'm just going to give a little bit of your background. So you've got a background in Krav Maga. You were a full instructor teaching civilian and law enforcement. But then in 2016, with Skulk, you started working on the Maul, and we're going to get to the Maul eventually. And that's where your knife making basically started. I got that from the website. Speaking of which, the website, the Ferm Eterni, I was like, I thought Ferm was a neuter word. So I was like, Eterni, shouldn't it be Eternum? And I started going back to my old Latin from high school, and I could figure it out. But then I was like, let me just Google that. So is it the Warhammer, 4K 40K reference, or is it something else?
No, no, it was just a sort of eternal blade or something like
Okay.
that we try to come up. I mean, it was a Google Translate, so it's probably not exactly as it should be.
This is me having 6 years of Latin in high school, so I always had this fondness of the Latin language. I looked it up, and
I'll
it
come to you
turns
next
out
time. We need a Latin translate then, because it's a tricky one for us to figure out sometimes.
it's difficult. I had 6 years of it, but I was not very good at it. So let me put your mind at ease. But I found out that it's in the Warhammer, the fantasy game. It was one of the ships, I think, in some battle or something, like you spelled it.
Okay.
So it exists. So I was like, okay,
Oh,
maybe he's a Warhammer fan. That could be true.
you have to speak to Skulk about that, because I do nothing about that. He's a big fan of that kind of thing.
So I want to talk obviously about a bunch of stuff, but the you design knives, and the focus that you guys have is just functionality, and it has to be practical. It's used for self-defense. It's not just ornamental,
Yeah.
but it is actually a working knife. Let's call it that. Is that a conscious choice to only focus on that, or how did that come about?
Look, I mean, my introduction to knife making was purely accidental. In 2016, when we were working on the Maul together, we decided as a unit that we wanted to work with Pical style knives specifically. We felt that was the best option, that gave people that we were training the best opportunity to learn something very quickly, and something that will work for them. And so that's the style of knife we chose. And being that it's a very unique kind of knife, you can't just walk into a shop and pick one up. And at the time, I was basically training full time, which doesn't pay a lot of money. And I couldn't really afford to go and get a custom knife made. There was at the time local people who could do that, but I couldn't afford it. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to make myself one. And that's what I did. I went into the garage and make myself a knife with a file. It took forever. And that's what I made a trainer first, just so we could test out some of the properties of it and the design functionality. And then eventually I made a live blade. And yeah, that's how my knife making journey began. It wasn't that I set out, I'd studied this or anything like that. I'd always been interested in it, but I never really thought anything could come of it. So I never really put any thought into it. But it was purely I needed one, and I made one. And that's how it started. And I posted pictures of that on Instagram. Because I was in the combatives industry, in the community, some people saw it and they were like, make me one as well. And that's 6 years later, this is where we are. So it's always been about the functionality and the purpose behind it. Obviously, as things expand as a business and your creative side comes out, you kind of want to build on your foundations a little bit and expand. So we have the basic models and the high-end models, but they all share the same functionality, the same foundation.
Yeah.
They're all the same at the end of the day. They're just done up nicely.
I always found it interesting because it's I collect knives. It's one of the few things I collect because it's well, the knives I collect, I typically go for not really the high end stuff or anything, but it has to have it has to speak to me. I think that's the main thing. It has to have something that speaks to me, and I'm like, okay, I want that one, and add it to the collection. But the main thing is that you have to find something that works for you.
Yeah.
If it's and I do have a bunch of functional knives as well, but those that are a little bit more or ornamental, and that I know like, okay, this is a beautiful knife, but it's not going to stand up to some of the stuff that your knives can stand up to. How do you go about designing a knife? If you could, are there specific steps like, okay, this is what a good, let's do that first. A no-nonsense functional knife. What are the criteria that you use to describe it as such?
So this kind of goes back to the early Maul days a little bit, because it was doing all of that stuff that told me what I needed to make.
Yeah.
In that period before we actually released the book and formalized the system, we don't really like to call it a system, but for lack of a better way of saying it, that's what it is. We did thousands and thousands and thousands of reps of scenarios of me approaching Skulk approaching me, just thousands and thousands of reps like that to see what was going to happen and what are the trouble, where are the trouble spots, not only for you to actually deal with that situation, but also the tool. And the big takeaway for me was the interaction between the hand and the blade, you know. Certain things like ergonomics, getting it out under duress, getting it snagged in clothing, in those reps, hitting things like belt buckles all the time. It happens surprisingly often, you know. So things like that, all the elements that I was taking in, saying, okay, if I'm going to design a knife for this problem, it has to be able to deal with these issues. And so that was the foundation I came up with. So for me, the robustness is a big deal. I know it's a very gray area because how tough a knife blade is determined by a lot of different factors. But we over-engineer it. We want to make sure that there's no possibility that thing can break during the encounter. That if you hit something hard like a belt buckle or a zipper or something like that, the tip isn't going to come off and it isn't going to decrease the functionality in that moment. Because that moment, if that thing is happening and that encounter is happening, it's a very serious thing. And you do not want anything that's going to decrease your odds of survival. That was the foundational philosophy behind what we do. So the over-engineering of it, the robustness of it is a big deal for us. That's the first thing. Then the ergonomics, the way it interacts with the human hand, it has to be there. It's a very difficult thing for a knife maker to make ergonomics that work for everyone. It's one of the trickiest parts about making a knife. But over the years, I've kind of refined what I like to do, and that's why a lot of my knives actually look the same. The handles don't generally differ a hell of a lot because the human hand is the same. I see a lot of designs where people go crazy with ergonomics just to make it look different, but you know, you've still got to hold it at the end of the day, and if it doesn't fit in your hand, then it's not going to work. So ergonomics, making sure that it doesn't come out the hand easily, that it's comfortable, it's not going to hurt you, because sometimes if you're really clenching down on something, it can actually hurt if you really do that. So there's got to be no hot spots in it. There's got to be no sharp edges on it. It's a weird thing, like, but holding onto a knife is a lot more to do with the profile shape than anything like rings. I stay away from rings because I think they don't offer as much benefit as they offer risk. I think it's pretty much negated. So I didn't see the benefit over the risk for that. But it's a very strange thing when you boil down ergonomics, because I found a lot of the times when we were sparring that just knocking someone slightly off of balance can initiate you to open your hand because you're going to brace. So your brain thinks I'm going to fall. That's what it defaults to. It lets go of the knife because it's going to brace against the wall or the ground or something. So even something as little as that can negate all your ergonomics in your design. So it's a very tricky balance to find something that works well under that specific problem. What have I covered? I covered the robustness, the ergonomics, and then also the big thing is actually the carrying, the deployment of the knife. You got to have a sheath that won't let it fall out, but will let the knife come out when you need it to. And that's a very tricky, fine balance as well.
And how about edge geometry and overall shape of the blade?
So for me, edge geometry, I like to go somewhere in the middle. You get like the really, really fine edges and you get the really robust edges. I like to go somewhere in the middle that's going to give you a robust enough edge with a lot of material behind it to support that edge so it won't roll very easily, but then not too fine that it doesn't need to be a razor blade. If you're very honest about what combatives are for, it doesn't need to be a scalpel, okay? It actually needs to be able to hold up to certain rigors like hitting bone. That's a big deal. In testing, in organic testing and things like that, you hit bone all the time. And I don't believe this idea that you can be such a skilled precision artist that you're going to get between the bone all the time on this person, that you in a dynamic situation. You're kind of just going for something and hoping you get something a lot of the time, especially in that ambush type situation. When you're dueling, that's a different story. But we designed our knives and our philosophy around the ambush, which means you don't really have time to pick this person apart. You just have to hit them. And so you want to be able to make sure that that edge withstands, and that tip especially withstands the harder organic materials and the belt buckles and things like that. So the edge geometry is somewhere in the middle ground. I think is the best place for it in this context. Because context is everything.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. And it's this is one of the most difficult things for some people to understand, especially early on in their training, is that the specifics do matter. The best example, I think, is when you look at the military. They basically do divide it up in like, well, you guys are going to fight on land, you guys are going to fight in the water, and you guys are going to fight in the air. And a lot of what they do, the strategies, the tactics, the techniques are not compatible. They aren't. Why? Well, because just the platform that they have to use, where they are, the context is radically different. And if you start with, okay, we're starting with the ambush as where we are going to begin our training and what we are preparing for, that is, like you said, radically different from actually dueling with somebody, which is not something you're supposed to be doing anyway. Now, it can and does happen. You know, if you pull a knife, the other guy pulls a knife, all of a sudden it's a very different context. But then still the goal shouldn't be to, you know, do 5 rounds, but maybe get out of there as quickly as you can, which goes against. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But like what we like to say is that it might start with an ambush, but it can devolve into a duel sometimes if you let it get away from you a little bit.
Yeah.
But for us, our philosophy was always, if this thing is happening, this guy's attacking me, I'm going to do as much damage to him as possible in the shortest frame of time to either get him to disengage or to end him. And I have to make that decision very, very quickly, whether I'm going to carry on or not. But I don't want it to get to a duel. If it's become a duel, then I've made a mistake, ultimately. But yeah, it's a different thing. It's a different animal. But if it does get to that point, then at least you've also got a knife that's strong enough to deal with that problem as well. So I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I was talking to Tommy Bloom not so long ago, as a craft instructor from Scandinavia, and I asked him, okay, what is one of the myths that you see, you know, out there in self-defense? And he said that one of the things he mentioned is that people think that, you know, conditioning is not necessarily important and that it'll be over in an instant. And I agree with him. I think I see it as a scale, like just like you said, if it's an ambush and it's successful, I mean, you don't have a chance. If you have to counter the ambush and you do so effectively, it's very likely going to be over very quickly, because your job is to turn the tables on that guy or those guys and immediately go on the offensive as hard as you can, because they have the element of surprise, and well, unless they're stupid, they've set it up so that you really don't have much of a chance. So you have to go all out right away, which means keeping it short. It has to be over as quickly as possible. And if it's any other context, social violence, or, you know, that it's not an ambush, or that you see the ambush coming but you can't get out of it, it's still gonna happen, is where you have more time, it can be protracted. But if you're going for, like, you know, 10 minutes straight in something like that, there's a big problem there.
I think there's a bit of a problem with yourself, actually, more than necessarily anything else. The interesting thing about turning the tables on an ambush, I think often what we forget is that the attacker is a human being as well. He's also a person who wants to go home tonight. It doesn't want to have a hole in him. You know, so as soon as you turn those tables on that person, unless he's a proper psychopath or on some kind of methamphetamine or narcotics that has taken him to a level where he's not thinking rationally anymore, they don't want holes in them either. They don't want to be bleeding. They don't want that. And as soon as you turn the tables to a degree where it's like, oh, I didn't think that was going to happen, and now it's happening to me, 9 times out of 10, it's gonna have the result of disengagement, which is ultimately what I want as the victim. I want them to leave.
Yeah.
I don't want to hurt. I don't want to end up in court to try and defend my actions. I want them to run away. That's my best case scenario.
Yeah, I remember, and this is a long time ago. I think it was the first Gulf War or the second. I think the first, but I'm not sure anymore. And if I'm not mistaken, it was a British troop that was there, and they were basically, I mean, in a really bad spot, and they did the last known bayonet charge. So I mean, the sergeant or whoever said, "Okay, fix bayonets," and they just ran at the Iraqis, who were petrified and just couldn't handle it. And that's exactly like you said, is that no, you're a human being too. And imagine being the guy who has it planned out, who's been looking at his target and this and that, and he's got the whole ambush set up, and or him and his buddy, and they are waiting for the perfect time. You are not aware. They come at you, and the next second you are charging them with a knife, trying to end them. It's incredibly difficult to make that switch going from
Exactly.
predator to prey.
And it's not to say that it can't happen. I mean,
Of course.
we train for the worst case issue, but just because you're training for the worst case doesn't mean it's going to happen all the time.
Exactly.
We remember that as well, that criminals are human beings as well, especially the kind of criminals that we have here, where a lot of it is resource based. People are just trying to make a living, actually at the end of the day, they want to go to work tomorrow as well. They don't want to end up in hospital because it's bad for business. So
could you talk a little bit about what South Africa is like now? And I'll give you two maybe starting points. The first one is that I talked to a friend of mine a long time ago who is a surgeon, and he said he did part of his training in South Africa because edged weapon wounds were extremely common there. He said at that point it was like the capital of the world for knife wounds. And he said you didn't have to wait; you just did a shift, and there was somebody coming in who got stabbed or cut. So that's one aspect. If you could talk a little bit about just the prevalence of knives and edged weapons used in crime. And on the other hand, a few years ago, there was just massive violence and basically rioting and plundering going on in South Africa. And I followed that for a little bit. It seems to have simmered down, but obviously there was massive damage to, I mean, shopping malls, companies, towns, cities, and so on. What is the situation like now?
Okay. So the first question, South Africa is still a very violent country, if not even more so than it's ever been, purely because of the economic situation and situations like with our power being the way it is. It's made things worse, made things harder for people in general.
And I'm quickly going to interject and tell the audience that we have at maximum 2 hours before the electricity is shut down where you are. And that is like common. It's like every day. This is what happens.
It's been like that for nearly 20 years. It's just gotten worse every year. So, so the economic situation isn't good, and people are struggling. So crime is always going to be bad in a country like this. But the vast majority of people in South Africa live in very impoverished environments, and violence is normal. It's a very normal everyday thing for most people here. We often hear when people from other African countries like Zimbabwe and Namibia and Malawi and Kenya and all these places come to South Africa because it's a slightly better economic situation for them. But a lot of them comment of how dangerous South Africa is. It's more dangerous than their home countries. It's people escalate to violence very quickly. It can go from 0 to 100 like that. So the escalation is quicker, and people just in general seem to have a bit more disregard they have more willingness to get to that place. I think that's a big thing. In terms of knives specifically, it's such an easy thing to get hold of here. And it's cheap. You walk into any supermarket, you can buy a knife for the equivalent of like $2, a kitchen knife. So that's predominantly what you see here is just cheap kitchen knives. People find stuff in the trash that make weapons. You don't see expensive stuff. You'll see cheap Chinese knives and kitchen knives. That's predominantly what you're going to see. And security services and police pick that stuff up all the time, every day. They'll take bags and bags of that stuff away from people every day. So it's very easy to get edge weapons. Yeah, and that's the easiest thing to use. It's as simple as that. So that's what people default to, I think.
Yeah. All right. And then if you can look back a little bit to the time of all the plundering and the rioting and today, how it is now.
So interestingly, it's a bit of a weird one because where I live in Cape Town, in our province, it's the only province that's currently run by the opposition party. So it's actually a little bit better. It's not perfect, but it's better. And it was the one area in the country that wasn't really heavily affected by all the riots. Mostly happened in the rest of the country. So we're very grateful for that. I don't know what that says about the rest of the country versus this province. Maybe people are less prone to going there that quickly. I don't know. But I have friends who obviously live in other places in the country, and another prominent knife maker in South Africa, Xavier Knox, he was in a situation where he was literally surrounded. Their town was surrounded. They were camping out in the last grocery store. Wow. That had food in their town, and they were defending it for 2 solid weeks, shooting, and because people wanted to take it down, and that was the last food for like 100 Ks, so they had to defend it, and that was the situation in this country not so long ago, and it's very strange how it just disappeared. It ended, and no one says anything about it. It's just gone.
And also in the press and politics, same thing.
Nothing. No one's mentioned. You're the first person who's mentioned it to me in 2 years.
Wow.
It just disappears because honestly, this country is so saturated with violence. It's an everyday occurrence here. It doesn't make the headlines. It really doesn't, because I know in Europe, in places in Europe, if something bad happens to someone gets killed, it's a big deal. But it's pretty normal here. To be very honest with you, it doesn't make the news because it's everyday life for most people, yeah. And it's very polarizing because, I mean, I come from a very middle-class background. I lived in suburbs. So I'm not the impoverished sector of the population by a long stretch. But even people like me are used to crime. I saw my first shooting when I was 18. I saw my first guy get shot. I've seen shootouts between police and criminals a few times. And I'm not exactly a person who goes in looking for that kind of stuff. It just happens. And the average person in this country sees that. It's just normal. And it's even worse for people who live in the impoverished sectors of the world, of the country, because that's more every day for them than anything else. So you can't really underestimate the effect that has on people's psychology when you are growing up just exposed to that level of violence every day. It just becomes normal to you. As a child, that's what you're seeing. So how are you supposed to come out of that with any kind of sense of making things better if that's where your starting point is? It's very difficult. And so I don't know. I don't know if it's going to get better or worse. It's very difficult to gauge sometimes if it's getting better or worse, because we are kind of insulated from it where I live. You don't see it as often, but yeah, it's still there. And you have to realize and remember that it's still there. And every time you walk the streets, even in a nice neighborhood, you have to remember it's still there, because you might be in a nice neighborhood, but they're going to come. That's the hunting ground for them, so you got to be careful. On the beaches close to where I live, people get mugged every day. It's normal. A friend of mine about a month ago got mugged, got hit on the head with a rock, but his stuff was taken from him. That's just everyday life here.
Yeah. This is so hard for so many people in Western countries to understand that a society actually can get to that level of just having commonplace violence every day. And like you said, nobody nobody really bats an eye. It's just how things are. Yet society goes on. It still functions.
Exactly.
We're not in Mad Max territory just yet, but you know,
That's
you're closer to that than we are.
But that's the crazy thing, is that I can go to the city center and I can be surrounded by supercars, the latest Ferraris, the latest Lamborghinis. The money is insane. And 20 k's away, I'm in a township where no one has any money to buy bread. That's the level of disparity that exists in South Africa. It's very polarizing from one neighborhood to another. It changes like that. And so it's a very weird country in that sense. I think that we're very unique, that we have these huge differences between people's living conditions. Whereas most other countries in Africa, at least anyway, there is at least there's always going to be the rich and the haves and the have-nots, but the line between them is a little bit more tapered rather than just like immediately different.
Yeah, and this is historically also something that's been true. If inequality is really big, then violence tends to be more common, and eventually people rise up and revolt, and lots of violence happens some more, and often a new form of government is installed or something along those lines, and then the power centralizes again, and the cycle just repeats over and over. This is the tale of human history, and it sounds like you guys are already on the bad part of the cycle.
It's a difficult thing to. It's difficult to see where it's going to go, because I feel like South Africa as a country has a lot of good potential. I think every place does have potential to a degree, but it's one of these places where it's like, if they could just fix the power, we might have a chance. And then it's just, if they could just fix the crime, we might have a chance. There's always there's always something that you think they could just fix that.
Yeah,
we'd be there.
I was. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just saying, it's difficult to see on the horizon where it's going to go at any given time. It's a very tricky read.
Well, I was just talking to my girlfriend before I came to my office here to talk to you, and he says, "So how long are you going to be?" So, well, he has power until 10 o'clock. So, and then whatever we want to say, it's too late because he won't have electricity. So that's just how it goes. And she's like, "Really?" I'm like, "Yeah." And the funny thing is that so Europe has a lot of problems with generating energy and so on, given the war in Ukraine. My country has been so smart to shut down a few more nuclear reactors, and more on the way. And they're actually talking like not this year, but probably next year and 2025 that we will have a shortage of electricity. And we're talking about these rolling blackouts, different regions, kind of like you guys have. People over here are not ready for that. You said you guys have had that for like 20 years. Over here, they're not ready for that.
I remember the first one. It was very weird. I was still about 16 or 17 at the time, living in my parents' house, and the power just went off one day. And we thought, well, maybe there's something on the road, a fault on the line, and it'll be fixed any minute now. And it just didn't come back on for a day and a half. It was gone. We were like, is this the end? Because we don't know. And then ever since then, it's been a seasonal thing, and it's just gotten gradually worse and worse. And it was a systemic issue because the previous government, at the time of 1994, when the governments changed roles, the previous government had said to our current government, listen, the infrastructure needs to be improved. We already knew this, and we had these plans in place, and we advise that you take our plans and just run with them because you're going to need to. And they just went, thanks for your plans, and put it in the bin because you're an old regime and you don't know anything. And now we're sitting with the consequence of that, because 20 years later, the problems already should have been fixed 20 years ago. That's the reality of it. And now they're just patching things up, and it's a huge corruption issue as well. Our power utility had, for a very brief time, someone reasonably competent in its position who was basically exposed that R1 billion a month was being siphoned out of the utility, which it's about 200,000 euro, or give or take, about 20 million euro, sorry, give or take. So that's quite a lot of money every month. It's just disappearing, going into someone's hands, and you don't know where it goes. It just disappears. When lockdown happened, we got given a bunch of money from foreign aid, and it just didn't touch sides. Just disappeared. No one knows where it's gone, and that's unfortunately a huge issue with countries like ours, where corruption is the biggest problem, because there's no accountability and no one knows anything. No one has any solution to the problem, and no one knows what happened. And you can't get to the bottom of it, because the corruption is just so intrinsic in everything. Yeah, it's very difficult to fix anything when you've got that level of rot at the foundation.
Yeah,
So
I go ahead.
I think you guys in Europe at least have potentially better odds at fixing your power issues. But you need to. I think you guys also potentially a bit more, from our perspective anyway. It seems a bit more that you've kind of gone down this path because you've had comfort, and now times are turning a little bit, and now you don't really know what to do, because it hasn't been that bad for so long.
Well, I've been quoting Balaji Srinivasan for a while now, and saying we are ruled by clowns and arrogant idiots. We are ruled by people who could not build a system that they inherited and have to run. And as a result, they let it deteriorate and break down, which is kind of what you guys went through, but you're further down the road with that. And over here, it's happening. I mean, Germany did the most of any country, I think, in the world when it came to trying to get green energy and this and that. Shut down their last nuclear plant, I think, 2 weeks ago. They've never burned more coal than they do now. They are tearing down ancient forests to develop coal mines. They've never had this much CO2 coming out in the atmosphere. And industry is going to leave because they need stable power to function, which means impoverishing the country. And Germany has always been the engine of the European economy, so that engine is sputtering now. What could go wrong? Belgium says, "Hold my beer."
Yeah. I mean, you speak about the power being a big factor for the industry. I mean, for my business, it's a huge problem. I mean, the power goes off for 4 hours a day. How the hell are you supposed to cope with demand? And actually, every business here has generators. The generator industry is massive here. You want to make buck, get into generators, because you guys are probably going to need them soon.
Actually, just for today, I saw the joke. One of the Green politicians, who's a mayor somewhere, is going elsewhere, and she's moving or something, and she wants to get into politics, local politics there, and she said, well, if I don't get elected, then I'll have to find a job just like anybody else. And somebody replied on social media, "Get into diesel generators. That's a booming business thanks to you guys." I was like, yeah, you're not wrong.
You're not wrong. Like every industrial property that's for rent here, if it has a generator, they can demand higher prices, because it means that you work.
And this all ties together with the violence, and with knives being used, and learning how to use knives. And like we started out, you give this, you start doing a demo in front of a bunch of ladies, and they're surprised at how violent it is. Everything ties together. Societies have a certain way of functioning depending on the energy that is available in society at that point. If there's a lot of energy, societies tend to prosper, because you can make stuff, you've got energy to boot, you can export it, and like France is doing, they've got a bunch of nuclear reactors. Belgium has been importing French electricity for a while. They're actually running ours. So energy is basically the lifeline of a modern society. Less energy means less wealth, less prosperity, but also a lower living standard. Lower living standards, like you just said, people are struggling, which means that they have to look for resources, and eventually that turns to violence. So it's all connected. And I've seen for the longest time how in Western countries they no longer see that connection. spending time on frivolous laws and projects, while basically neglecting the fundamentals that keep us in this modern society. And bit by bit, those break down, and they can't fix it. They just don't know how to fix it. And you guys are at the end where it's not fully broken down, but it's the system is very fragile and not and it doesn't perform well. And like you said, try to fix that. I mean, it's not going to be one thing. It's going to be 100 things that go wrong altogether.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's interesting.
Go ahead.
Yes.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to. There's an interesting thing about what you were saying now, where Western countries they find other problems to fix, or they invent problems to fix, and that affects us as well at this side of the world, because anything that's going on in America affects me drastically, because my business is 95% overseas. I can't function on the local economy. So anything that's affecting Americans specifically and Europeans, it ultimately comes back to us.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. I want to ask you something else. I mean, you design knives, and this is a question of one of my patrons. What's the creative process like for you? Like, do you start with an idea, or is it something that comes to you, or another knife you've seen, or a concept? But what's the process for you?
Okay, so sometimes it's about a need. I can see there's a problem that needs to be fixed. Like the Pical stuff is directly as a result of our training.
And just for the audience, Pical is like reverse grip. It's more specific than there's more, but reverse grip is the easiest way to understand it.
Reverse grip, edge towards you. Other times I can see a design that is already commonplace, and I maybe want to put my own spin on that. Maybe improve it or make it my own a little bit. Something like a Warncliffe, for example. It's a design I recently did. But I'm always trying to be accommodating to other people as well. So I understand that my way of doing things is not the only way of doing things. And I'm trying to, especially now as I've become more established, I'm branching out a little bit more and trying to accommodate for other people's methodologies a little bit. And then also as I'm progressing down this line, I'm finding myself more and more as a designer attracted to the Japanese style traditional blades. I think for me, that's the artistry in that is it drives a lot of my creativity. I'm very attracted to the idea of Japanese traditional blades. Someday, maybe attempting katanas and things like that. But obviously, that's less functional, or less everyday functional anyway. Yeah, so there's two halves to me: the creative side and the functional side. Is always trying to kind of come together at a middle ground. But it's sometimes very interesting when you get these creative ideas, and then you've got to temper it down a little bit because you want to remain functional. And I think a lot of people sometimes forget to do that.
Well, that is actually what the next question I was going to ask, because it's also one of my patrons, and I wanted to have it on the main episode because it fits with my questions as well. Is how do you balance that, the artistic side and the functional side? How do you stop yourself from going too far in one direction?
Yeah. So for me, I like the Japanese way of thinking about things. This is where that Japanese influence comes in for me, is that the sword is the sword. When in Japanese, a katana looks like a katana. I mean, there's some subtle differences between makers, but it's fundamentally still the same thing. Even the handle is fundamentally still the same thing, but the execution of it is where the artistry comes in. So the beauty lies in the execution of it and the precision of it and the materials used versus the actual the thing as a whole. The thing as a whole is still functional, but the artistry is in the execution and the materials and things like that. So that's how, if you look at one of my high-end Shrike knives versus the basic entry-level model, they're exactly the same thing. They're just the high-end ones dressed up nicer. So fundamentally, it's exactly the same knife, and it will perform exactly the same way. So I look at that as my basis. The functionality is the foundation, and then I build on that with material choices and sometimes you could argue it's less practical, but I try to make sure that it is practical by testing it out and carrying it and making sure that it's comfortable and it's going to be hard wearing and it's not going to fall apart and things like that. I do think there is a limit. Sometimes you can't get too crazy with certain materials and certain techniques because they just lend themselves more to art knives. But I think for the most part, if you're making good material choices, you can be artistic in your execution of them and how you pull them off. And subtle things like even texturing a piece of G10, which is just a very plain, simple material, but the way you texture it can bring a level of creativity and artistry into what would normally be a very functional material.
And speaking of that, correct me if I'm wrong, because this has been a while since I read on that. But that one of the reasons that I found was that the shape and the way the Japanese swords were made was in part due to the poor quality of the metal that they had available to them. So the folding and the hammering of the metal, that process, which is actually still used in industry worldwide. I mean, outside of making swords to this day, that was a limiting factor. The quality of the iron was a limiting factor. So that determined the functionality because you can't make a much different blade than that. Now you don't really have that limitation. I'm guessing you have access to much higher quality metal to use for the blade. So how do you square that? So you've got the Japanese influence, which I clearly saw and very much like, but at the same time, you don't have those constraints that they have.
I guess it's for me, it's more of an aesthetic. The Japanese influence. It's not fundamentally in terms of the steel integrity at all. I tend to, functionality-wise, we use pretty much what you'd call modern steel, modern homogeneous steel. I've very rarely ever used things like Damascus, just because it's from a functionality perspective, a mono steel is actually better. Really, it's a single steel that's heat treated all the way through is going to perform way better than something that's not homogeneous and hasn't been heat treated all the way through like a Japanese blade would have been. I mean that's was also a matter of opinion because every year in the steel industry they come out with new steels, and this steel is going to be better than the last one. When it comes to knife application, I honestly believe that 95% of people are never going to know the difference between the latest, greatest super steel and one that was good 10 years ago. You'll probably never get to the limits of that steel's performance. We forget that a lot of steel, we in the industry forget that a lot of steels actually has industrial application. It's made for like making these big guillotines and things for the paper mill and that kind of stuff. It's not meant for your pocket knife. It works. There's nothing wrong with it, but you'll never get to the limits of that thing's performance ability because just by cutting a bit of wood at the campfire, So I honestly think that we kind of get overwhelmed by all the steel options and that kind of stuff, and what it boils down to actually is just choosing something that's good and appropriate, treating it properly, and then you get the functionality out of it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And one of my students, he is pretty high up at Bekaert, which is one of the biggest steel manufacturers in the world. And we talked about that. It's just, look, because I wanted to have him on the podcast and see how we can make that relevant to what we talk about. Because he mentioned sharpening. I mean, that's not really our thing. Don't ask me and my guys how to make the perfect edge on metal, because that's not really what we do. But we will actually know how to make, for instance, a steel cable that's going to be used in the mining industry, which is going to be dragged over rock and this and that. So it has to be able to withstand abrasion and so on. And steel beams for construction has totally different requirements and all that. It's extremely specialized. It gets to be very complex depending on the function that steel needs to perform in. But I agree with what you said is that for the vast majority of the people, they just won't know the difference. If you do, it's kind of like tasting wine. You have the $5 bottle and the $500 bottle. and many people won't be able to tell the difference if you pick the right ones.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just, like I said, it's just a matter of picking something that's adequate, that will do the job, and then just treating it, because the heat treat is actually as important as the steel choice. You can have a really high-end super steel and heat treat it wrong, and you'll have a terrible knife. So, yeah, or you can have a really cheap steel that you heat treated properly, and it will perform amazingly. So it's not just the steel choice. Sometimes people they get drawn in by that sticker when they're buying something that's the latest M390 or LMAX or whatever, something like that, and they think super steel means it must be good. If it's been made badly, it's not going to be good at all. So there's that factor as well. People need to be careful.
What I also liked is the way that you work is you've got the different tier knives, so tier 1, 2, and 3, which is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's mostly about, you've got basically a standard, let's call it off-the-rack knife, which would be tier 1. And then progressively, as you go through the tiers, there's more customization, more detail, and so on. Is that a fair way of saying it?
That's correct, yeah. So over the years, we've been I say we because I include my partner and who helps me make knives, Elijah. He's come on in the last 3 years or so. Originally it was just me, and I was just making stuff to order, and it was some guy would approach and say, I want a knife with this handle, and then someone else would say, I want something with this handle and this steel and this finish, and it eventually got to a point where you're just working with so many different materials and so many different options. It became very overwhelming and very difficult for me to manage that. And so over the years, we've actually developed this tier system where we have a very basic bare bones knife off the shelf. If someone just wants something purely utilitarian and functional, it's available. They can buy it. They'll have it within a couple of weeks, depending on where they are in the world, and they're good to go. And then if you do want some customization or personalization, the second tier gives you a little bit of options where you can tweak colors here or materials there, finishes there, but not super hectic customization either. And then tier 3 is like full customization. You can have different steels, different patterns, modify the actual shape, have something completely designed from scratch if you want to. Because occasionally we do get people who want something, their dream knife that they've been dreaming of for a couple of years, and us to create it for them. So we have to have that option open for people as well. But it's been a difficult balancing act to try and find the balance, actually, of from a business perspective of what works and what doesn't, and what people want, because as is typical, when people say they want X and then you make X and then they want Y, and you don't have any of that left, so then you make Y and then they want X again. It's like you constantly jumping back and forth between what people want and chasing that goal. But I think we finally settled on something that actually works.
Yeah, and also there's the part that I guess a lot of the customers don't really think about, but there's inventory management, there's stock management. I mean, you can't just keep up buying tons and tons of iron to work with, and then finish a bunch of knives and then not sell them. That's not how a business works. So customization obviously clearly is great, but if a client has a specific material in mind that he wants you to work with, but you don't have it and you have to buy it, especially for him, that's going to be far more expensive than one that you can buy more in bulk and get a better price for. So it's a difficult balancing act, I can imagine, just making custom knives. Are there people that you've said, like, look, I can't do this, that you turned away?
We are getting... I struggled with that in the beginning because I'm the kind of person who doesn't like conflict, actually, and I always want to make people happy. And so I always, in the beginning, I used to just take on whatever someone said to me or ask for me. And then I've learned over the years that sometimes you have to say no, because it's just too much trouble in the long run. So we have turned people away before. One thing that people also don't understand about our particular unique situation is that about 90% of the material we use is imported. It has to come from somewhere else. Yeah. The steel, it comes from Germany and the US. Handle materials come from the US. Even the kydex we make the sheath out of comes from the US. All the clips come from the US. All the materials used for Japanese handles come from Japan. So it's a very cost the cost of importing all that when you have a very weak economy versus the US dollar, it increases the cost of everything as well, and in the timeline as well. We've had stuff that was that took 8 months to import. Literally
Wow.
took 8 months to get here. Not because it took 8 months to get to South Africa, because once it got to South Africa, it took 8 months to get through the customs port. And you're dealing with third world development where things just go missing and you have no idea where it is. And one day it turns up if you're lucky. So it's tricky sometimes to deal with the logistics of running a business where you have all these primarily imported materials that have to come in to make your product. And then you still got to do it at a reasonable price, and you've got to ship it overseas, which is also very expensive. I mean, people don't realize that the cost of us getting a knife from South Africa to the US is about $40 that we absorb.
Yeah,
that's just
a lot.
getting it to your door. So we take that cost as in our price. We don't charge shipping as extra as part of the price tag, but we have to foot that bill.
Yeah, and also so I know that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just getting it to you is a huge cost that people don't realize is there.
Yeah, I also saw that you had trouble with PayPal, that they've made your life very difficult.
That was, I like to say that every year we have a big crisis, and this year our big crisis was PayPal. And about a week after we came back from holidays in January, we got an email from PayPal that just said, basically, your account is seized. You have no recourse. Your account will be closed. You cannot do business anymore. We are keeping the funds that are in your account, and it's because you broke terms of service. And the specific terms that they used were, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something like you were selling firearms and firearms accessories, which we obviously don't do.
Yeah.
But basically, there's no recourse. There's no, like, if you want to appeal this decision, you can email this person or phone us here. Nothing. It's just, this is the decision, end of story. Now, for a lot of businesses, maybe overseas, it may not be a big deal, but for us, it's a big deal because we're an international facing business. So as you know, all our pricing is in dollars because 90% of our customers are in the US and in Europe, and it makes sense for them to be able to transact in a currency they understand. But PayPal was the only card payment processing company that would allow us to transact in US dollars and withdraw the funds to our local business account.
Yeah.
So when that gateway shut, it pretty much killed our business. We were cut off at the knees, and our revenue stream just died instantaneously. And for the last 4 months or so, it's been pretty much 50% at best. So that really almost killed us. And the reality is that for any other business, I don't really know how we've actually survived. But the reality for us as a South African business, we can't just go to any other company and say, listen, we'd like to change and have you as our payment process.
Yeah.
Because like South Africa business, we don't deal with you. Sorry, cheers. So we've had to actually do really drastic measures and actually open a US business now. So we've become registered as a US business so we can have access to first world payment processing. And that's come at huge expense at a time when we've been cut off at the knees by a really strange decision. And that's also goes back to the thing I was talking about earlier when I said the decisions made in Western countries affect us.
Yeah.
This arbitrary decision that someone at PayPal made that they're no longer going to deal with this company, or because they broke some arbitrary rule that we didn't even break, has drastic effect on the livelihoods of 3 people.
Yeah.
In a country that you don't think about. And in the surrounding industry as well. I mean, we have suppliers that we deal with locally that they're going to lose out on business now because of this. That has a knock-on effect, and it's a really arbitrary decision. And I come to term this as basically economic censorship.
Yeah.
They've decided that not only am I not allowed to sell the product I make, but you're not allowed to buy it. They won't allow you to buy my product. So that's economic censorship.
Yeah, and this has been going on for a while. I think this is a few months ago already, a while ago actually, where it came out that PayPal had changed their terms of service that they could actually fine you for breaking one of their rules. And it was obviously well hidden into the whole because nobody reads the terms of service. They're huge.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people like, holy crap, are you guys insane? You're gonna fine us, which is basically was, we're gonna take this money out of your account because you did a bad thing, in our opinion. So a lot of people rebelled, lots of outrage online, and then no, this was a mistake, and they removed it, and then like 2 weeks later they put it back in. So and as a business, you cannot function that way. You need to have trustworthy partners and suppliers to work with, because otherwise, I mean, something like this happens, and like you said, all of a sudden you're basically hamstrung. They just cut you off at the knees, and you have to keep going. But if I understand it correctly, just by opening up the American side, business-wise, that helps.
It helps because it gives us access to more choice.
Yeah.
So in my research now, like even all the big payment processors like Stripe and Venmo and all those other big ones, they're pretty much the same. They all have the same policies, the same terms of service, and so you're never really going to get away from it. But what it does allow us is it gives us access to the smaller guys who are willing to take your business and don't have those kinds of policies in play. So we found one that we hope is going to work out. I don't want to say too much just yet because it's not finalized, but there does seem to be a pushback. At least there's companies out there that are saying, or at least publicly saying, that they don't believe in this kind of thing, and it's economic censorship, and they're going to be the if they don't want your business, we'll take your business kind of thing. I hate to say, a very right wing kind of thinking, but it's the pushback against the sort
firearms.
It's the firearm community and the knife community is hugely affected in the States. It's a huge part of the industry. It's $1 billion industry. Do you think it's just going to curl up and die? Like the knife industry alone is $1 billion industry in the US. Do you think is this going to stop? Someone's going to take that money.
And also it's not. I mean, it's not just the knives you make, which are meant to be used as self-defense. There's this knife shop that I like to go to when I'm in California, and the guy makes his own knives, sells a bunch of them, but he also has like a local knife maker who just puts them there, and when he sells them, the shop owner gets a little cut. And my girlfriend bought two of her kitchen knives there. It's a Japanese bladesmith, and he makes these gorgeous knives, and they're really good. And she's like, I mean, they're not cheap, but she uses them every day. She's so happy they fit perfectly in her hand and so on. Those people are affected too. They don't even touch, the self-defense part of knife making. It's like, it's a freaking kitchen knife. You can buy it on any online store with your PayPal account, but you can't buy it from an independent knife maker who makes one that is maybe a lot better than whatever you can get online. Because for whatever reason, well, no, we don't want to work with knives. We don't want to work with guns. So you guys are out.
Yeah, it's the independent makers that suffer the most. You can still use PayPal to buy a katana that's sharp, that can decapitate someone, but you can't buy a small knife.
Yeah, and I saw on the website that you guys are having a promotion for now with on a lot of the knives that they're discounted. So folks, it's Ironside edgeworks.com, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Now is your time to get a really good deal on Gavin and Elijah's work, because and this is something that I must make sure that I mention, because they're freaking gorgeous knives as well. They're really, really well done. I am not a weapon freak or anything like that. What I do very much admire and like is craftsmanship. It doesn't matter what the tool is or what the machine is. If it's done by someone who's an artisan, a skilled worker who is clearly a craftsman, and that then translates in whatever it is that you get from that person. That is my thing. I was once in a Japanese restaurant, one of the few ones over here that has a Michelin star, and we sat at the counter, see the chef work. The way he was handling that chef's knives, the way he was cutting, I mean, it's millions of reps that he did, and you could see him focus for a few seconds, and then he starts cutting, and there was no single wasted movement. It was like a ballet. Every single cut was precise. The way he cleared whatever was lying that needed to go away, the way he cleaned the knife. And in like a matter of a minute or two, from just raw materials, ta-da, here's the dish. And that's craftsmanship. And I appreciate that a lot. And I think the knives that you guys make are really, really nice. So folks listening, don't hesitate, because once they're gone, they're gone. But now's your chance to buy them. And what kind of payment options do you have now for people?
Unfortunately, at the moment, the only thing we have is a local card processor, which means we have to send you a payment link, and it has to be in our local currency.
Yeah.
So it still works fine, and it's the equivalent to the US dollar price. But some folks overseas sometimes have issues with that because their card company themselves see that as a weird transaction. And
they flag it.
Yeah, so it is possible, but it might take a phone call or two. But hopefully by the end of this month, we'll have a proper new payment gateway sorted out. So we're hopeful for
But I would tell to the audience, like, don't let that stop you. It's worth the phone call. Just do it.
We need the support at the moment now more than ever, because it's the sort of last hurdle, and before we actually get ourselves out of this mess, and we don't want people to hold back because we kind of need it now.
I'm looking at the time, because we do have, I don't want to get it too close to 10 o'clock, because if the power cuts out early, we're kind of screwed. So I would suggest that we go to the bonus part on Patreon, which I have a bunch of questions. Now, what I have is for where people can reach you, obviously see all the knives and the wonderful work we do is Ironside Edge Works.com. And I'll have a link in the show notes for that. And I'll also put a link to your Instagram and Facebook account in the show notes, and a link to the book, the Maul. We didn't really get to that, but maybe we can cover some of that in the bonus episode when we get to the questions. Or anything you want to add, Gavin, before we move on over?
Been very cool chatting.
Same here. I enjoyed it. It's always great to get a guest I haven't talked to before, and I don't talk about it all that much because it's my private life, but I like knives and I collect them, and it's one of the things that I'm not extremely passionate about, in the sense that I'm going to shout it over the rooftops, but it's a thing that I like, and like I said, it's clear that you both take pride in your work, and you can see it in not just the knives, but also the way that they are packaged and so on. It's what is it again? The Japanese concept Kaizen. So the Japanese concept of basically continuously making small improvements, progress, and so on. And I can see that clearly, that you guys are evolving and growing and trying to just always do it a little bit better, which is by far not the standard. Far.
Well, I firmly believe in the philosophy: if it's worth doing, it's worth doing as well as you can. And as in life, you're always going to get better at something. So therefore, you should always have an improving line of where you want to be. I'm always trying to improve every aspect of what we do. Everything is handmade. There's always a handmade element in what we do as well. So we freehand grind things. So they're never going to be perfect, but they're going to be as close to perfect as we can get them.
And that's the most important thing. All right, folks, we are heading over to the Patreon bonus episode, so you can join us there. Obviously, my podcast is Patreon supported, so it's my patrons that are actually making sure that we can do this. And the fun part for them is that, aside of a lot of the content that I make, they also get to ask my guests questions, and we're going to answer those. Gavin, thank you so much, and folks listening or watching us on YouTube. Talk to you guys next time.
Yes.